said, welcome back to our weekly series of FSHD Society Sequester Camp webinars. I'm Beth Johnston, Chief Community Engagement Officer, and together with Jun Kinishito and our guest speakers today, we hope we're going to have a really great session. Just so you know, again, we've created this webinar series especially for our FSHD community. It's going to run every Thursday at the same time for as long as we need it to share information, resources, and especially this much needed social support during this time. We're also streaming this live on Facebook, I think. If we can get the Facebook live streaming going, you can join us there from there as well, and also the recording will be kept there. Today on our sixth of these webinars, we have some very special guests with us, and I'm going to turn it over to June now to introduce them.
Very good. Thanks, Beth. So today we have two really foremost researchers in the FSHD field. We're very excited to introduce them to you. We have Johanna Hamel, MD. She's a neuromuscular specialist and assistant professor of neurology, pathology, and laboratory medicine at the University of Rochester up in Rochester, New York. So she sees FSHD patients in clinic, and she also conducts clinical research studying outcome measures and disease mechanisms, and you'll be hearing a lot more about that during this presentation. Our other speaker today is Dr. Chad Heatwole. He's a clinical researcher and neurologist also at the University of Rochester. Dr. Heatwole leads an internationally recognized network dedicated to improving existing clinical trial infrastructure through the development of disease-specific patient-reported outcome measures. He's developed such instruments for many, many conditions, and we're really grateful that he's done this also for FSHD because it's a really important stepping stone towards clinical trials for FSHD. So with that, I would like to turn it over now to Drs. Hamel and Heatwole.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. I hope you can hear me properly. I will start sharing my screen. And well, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to show some of our data here on patient-reported symptoms in FSHD. This work was published last year in Neurology, and thanks to many of you who are members of the National Registry and who filled out the questionnaires. And so I'll walk you through this, and this work is from Dr. Heatwole, and I was able to participate, and he's available for any questions at the end as well. But let's get started. So this study had the goal to capture your perspective, the patient perspective, on what having FSHD means to people, what symptoms are most common, and what symptoms are most important to you. And why is this important? While the answer may seem self-evident or intuitive to you, historically, the patient perspective has not always been included in medicine or research. And so in the past years, decades, it has been recognized that patient-reported outcomes are key in understanding a disease, but also when measuring a potential effect of a drug. But now, what is a patient-reported outcome? The FDA has answers for us. They define a patient-reported outcome as a report of the status of a patient's health condition that comes directly from the patient without interpretation of anyone else. And they recommend to use it whenever we're trying to measure a concept best known by the patient or best measured from the patient perspective. Now, how do we get there? How do we learn what people with FSHD experience? And you may tell me, well, ask the right questions. There have been many neuromuscular questionnaires out there used across other neuromuscular diseases. However, as you know, there are unique features in each muscle disease, and different questions may need to be asked to get information about those. And therefore, it makes sense to take a step back and ask, what are the right questions for patients with FSHD? And so what Dr. Heatwole did with his team is ask patients with FSHD what questions he should ask. And so in this first preliminary step, in-depth interviews were performed by telephone with 20 people with FSHD. And participants were asked very open questions to identify what symptoms were important to them and what symptoms they experienced. And all interviews were audio recorded and answers analyzed into categories of symptoms, and the frequency of quotes was documented. And so this is a figure out of the publication that was published in 2012 in Muscle and Nerve. And here you can see that all these quotes, hundreds and hundreds of quotes, were identified into several categories, and then the frequency of quotes was recorded as well. And so based on this information provided through those qualitative interviews, a survey was developed asking about 15 symptomatic themes, for example, limitations with mobility and walking, and 274 questions in each questionnaire. Then it was split into 137 questions. So a lot of questions were developed that targeted at specific symptoms. So while the symptomatic themes are more broader and general, such as limitations with mobility and walking, the specific questions were, for example, do you have difficulty with stairs? And so this survey not only asks whether a symptom is present or not, but also if someone experiences the symptom, how it impacts their lives. And those answers were scored as depicted here on that slide. So if the symptom was experienced, does it affect my life? Does it affect it a little, moderately, very much, severely? And then the answers were scored into an impact score. And that impact score you will see in the data in just a bit. So the impact score ranges from 0, so it doesn't have an effect on a patient's life, to 4, most severely. So if an issue affects the patient's life a little, it's scored as a 1. If it affects the patient's life moderately, scored as a 2. If it affects the patient's life very much, 3, and very severely would be a 4. Now, we also wanted to know if there are factors that may influence people's experience with the disease, such as age, gender, how long they've had symptoms, so duration of symptoms or disease duration, whether they were employed or not, how far they were able to go in education, and whether they had pain or not. And so here's some of the information on who participated. This survey was sent out to more than 500 people in members of the National Registry that was established in Rochester in 2003, and about 64% of people returned the completed surveys. And so a total of 328 people participated, and about half of them were women. The average age of participants when they filled out the questionnaire was 55. But note that people as young as 23 and as old as 86 completed surveys. And the age of symptom onset that was reported by patients was on average 23. As you see, most of participants were Caucasian, and other ethnicities and races were represented as smaller numbers. Now, with regards to employment, people that are younger than 65 years of age, which I defined as retirement age, about half of those were employed, a little more than half of them. And then when you look at education in this group of people, compared to the national average, the patients were a lot more educated in terms of that people, a higher percentage of people had master's and doctorate's degrees and college degrees. So now let's go to the data. Here we present the answer or the answers of the 15 symptomatic themes. And here you see from the top to the bottom, the symptomatic themes and how many of the 328 people experienced them in descending order. So the numbers on the right are given in percentage. So about 96.9% of people of the 328 experienced problems with shoulders and arms, and then 95 inability to do activities, 94% around back, chest, or abdominal weakness or truncal weakness. About 94% also experienced fatigue. About 94% also experienced limitations with mobility and walking, and about 92% experienced changed body image due to the disease. And then note that almost 88% of people experienced pain, and I'll get to that in a little bit again. And then I also want you to note that while problems with hands and fingers, problems eating, and communication difficulties was experienced by a smaller number of people, this will again come up later when we look at employment status. And so I want you to note that the top 5 most commonly experienced symptoms involve symptoms of the shoulders and the arms, but also truncal weakness, so back, chest, or abdomen weakness, leg weakness, fatigue, and changed body image due to the disease. And here on the right side, I'm showing you the answers with regards to the impact these symptoms have on people's lives for those who experience the symptom. And again, there are average, let me just move this down. There are average impact scores. So it's possible that someone replied, yes, this affects me severely, or this affects me a little. But taken all individuals together who experience the symptom, this is their average score. And so the items again are presented in descending order. So the higher the number, the greater the impact on people's lives. And what I want you to note is that the most commonly reported symptoms, so the box here is the same, they're just flipped in order, so that the 5 most common symptoms are also the 5 that have the greatest impact on people's lives. And I just want you to note that limitations with mobility and walking moves up to rank 2 here. And as you can imagine, that there's a close connection to quality of life and independence. So leg function is important, and that will come out later in some other data that I'll present. Now, when we look at factors that may influence how many people experience a symptom, we found that the largest differences existed between employed and unemployed people. In this graph, I will show you on the left here, again, the symptomatic themes, and on the right side in bars, the proportion of how many of the participants experienced these themes or these symptoms, grouped into red, unemployed, and blue, employed participants. And significant differences are marked here with a little star right next to the theme. So what I want to point out here is that, for example, problems eating was experienced by 60% of unemployed participants, while only half to 30% of employed participants. Also more common in unemployed participants with FSHD were problems with hands and fingers here and communication difficulties. Also more common was limitations with mobility and walking, pain, and fatigue. Now in this graph here, it's a similar graph, but now I'm depicting the impact of symptoms on people's lives who experience the symptom. So here again, you see the symptomatic themes, and on the right, you see the impact score. In blue, the unemployed, and in orange, the employed participants. Participants who were unemployed reported a greater effect on their lives for 8 symptomatic themes. All of these are marked with a little star here. So greater impact of problems with shoulders and arms, limitations with mobility and walking, inability to do activities, truncal weakness, fatigue, problems with physical health, and problems with hands or fingers. So this was employment. Now let's shift gears and look at pain, because nearly 88% of people with FSHD reported pain. So we were interested in how much that might influence these results. And here again, you see the symptomatic theme on the left, and here people with significant pain, so where it affects people's life moderately or greater, are marked in red, and in blue, people who have minimal or no pain. And participants who experienced moderate or severe pain were more likely to report 6 symptomatic themes compared to people with no or minimal pain. And those included changed body image due to the disease, problems with physical health, problems with hands and fingers, decreased performance in social situations and satisfaction in social situations, emotional issues, and difficulty thinking. Again, similarly to my previous slide, This is again looking at pain, the effects of pain, and the impact these symptomatic themes have on people's lives. And again, here you see the symptomatic theme, the statistically significant results marked with the star, and then the people with moderate or severe pain in blue, and the people with little or no pain in orange. Participants with minimal or no pain reported a lower effect on their lives for 8 symptomatic themes, marked here with the star. Problems with physical health, fatigue, changed body image due to the disease, trunk or weakness, inability to do activities, limitations with mobility and walking, and problems with shoulders and arms was all reported as having less of an effect on their lives in people with little or no pain compared to people with moderate or severe pain. Now, in addition to pain level and employment status, we looked at associations of gender, age, how long people had the disease, and education levels. And what is notable here is that for looking at how frequent symptoms were reported or how common symptoms were, there was no difference between the men and women. However, people with older age experienced more frequently limitations with mobility and walking. People who had the disease longer, so longer disease duration, experienced more frequent problems with hands and fingers, and reported more frequently decreased satisfaction in social situations. And people with higher level of education were less likely to report problems with hands or fingers, emotional issues, difficulty thinking, and communication issues. And similarly, when we look at the impact, again, on what impact symptoms had on people's lives, women actually reported a higher impact of decreased performance in social situations and a higher impact of fatigue on their lives. People with older age reported, again, similarly to the previous slide, greater impact of limitations with mobility and walking. And then people who had the disease for longer reported a greater impact of limitations with mobility and walking and problems with shoulders and arms. And then people who had a higher level of education were less impacted by problems with shoulders and arms, less impacted by fatigue, problems with physical health, less impacted by pain, and decreased performance in social situations. Now, as I mentioned before, patients did not only answer questions about these 15 symptomatic themes, but also more specific questions. So here on the left, I show you the answers on the most commonly reported symptoms. And here on the right, I'm showing you the questions and the impact score of the items that had the greatest impact on people's lives. And what I want you to note here is that the top 6 symptoms that are most commonly reported by people in this group involve shoulder and arm weakness. However, symptoms with the greatest impact on people's lives, the top 6, not only include shoulder and arm weakness, but 3 out of the 5 here involve weakness of legs, pointing out again how important leg function is to people. So to summarize, as you know, patients with FSH can have many symptoms affecting not just physical, but also emotional and social health. Compared to other diseases, and this similarly strategy has been, a similar study and strategy has been done in other neuromuscular diseases such as myotonic dystrophy and spinal muscular atrophy. So comparing to those groups of people, the association between education level and presence of symptoms was higher. And that has a second point, because that level of education may also influence the type of occupation and ability to continue to work within the profession that may have influenced the data that I showed you with the discrepancy between employed and unemployed people. In addition, pain is, as we know, an important, common, and troubling symptom in FSHD in many patients, and the occurrence of pain was not dependent on age or disease durations, highlighting that it's really important in all age groups in patients with FSHD. So we expect that these patient-reported data will, or we hope that this patient-reported data will assist with identifying areas to develop treatments, aid in the development and selection of relevant outcome measures, and guide physicians in the care of patients with FSHD in clinic. And it has helped me to think about what questions I should ask in clinic. And with that, I would like to thank specifically also everyone who filled out the service and made this study possible, and would like to open up for questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. We have a comment here from a person in the audience. She says that the category of limitations with mobility and walking seems to be equated with leg weakness. And this attendee thinks this is not correct. She says she has very strong legs but cannot walk due to trunk weakness. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I would agree 100%. That's very true. And that's always the problem if you have symptomatic themes, that they're very general and cannot identify the root cause of the mechanical problem of mobility and walking. And truncal weakness, but on the other hand, we do have the truncal weakness reflected in the back, chest, and abdomen weakness that we were hoping to reflect the truncal weakness in that item. That's why it's important to have symptomatic themes that are more general and broad, and then these targeted specific questions that ask, about more the details. And I can also, I showed you another comment on that is limitations with mobility and walking is very, very general. And you've noted that older patients have more limitations with mobility and walking, and it impacts their life. And that actually is true for the general population as well. So then, arthritis comes in, and so other aspects that may not be related to FSHD play a role in that as well. So that's why it's important to have a cluster of questions that target different aspects. So I 100% agree with that observation, yeah.
Great, thank you. There's a question asking if there's an association between the occurrence of leaving jobs due to FSHD symptoms. Or I guess maybe maybe she's asking if there are particular symptoms that are associated more strongly with the need to leave a job.
Yeah, this survey, this data set did not particularly answer that question. So I can't answer that question based on the data set. But in the registry, I know, for example, we ask, did you require disability due to FSH or due to your neuromuscular disease? And sometimes ask more detailed questions about what that was. Yeah, I think you can probably try to, I could make an assumption because it's notable that people that are still employed have less of these issues with mobility and walking, and with specifically hand weakness. So you could infer that, but the specific question of which symptoms mostly result in the need for disability, I can't answer on that data set, but it is an interesting question. So I would have to go back to the registry data and see if we can answer the question based on the other data set.
That would be really interesting. I thought it was striking, the association between higher education and, you could say, almost protection against some of the impacts of the disease. How do you interpret that?
And please, so Dr. Heatwole can join in any time and correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah, I think that's very interesting. I think so. It's always based on this. We can also only note associations and no causality. So I can't tell what caused what, but I think that the ability to remain in a profession is probably dependent on education level. So desk job, might be people can remain in a job better if if it's accommodating the physical limitations. And then if you do have a job that requires a lot of physical hard labor, I don't know, what does it do to the disease? Does it accelerate progression? Does it accelerate pain, which then on the other hand affects all these other items? I don't know that. That's a speculation, but those would be interesting questions to answer. Yeah, while we know that exercise is extremely important for people with FSH, we don't know, what type is physical labor or construction work, is that really beneficial? It's a strain on people with, it can be a strain on bone health, etc. in healthy people. So we don't know actually what those challenges do to a body with FSH.
Just to add a little bit what Johanna mentioned, I think that is right. I mean, it really highlights there is limitations here. These are associations. So we see that there's association between how far someone can get in their education and the symptoms of FSHD. But that's absolutely right. It doesn't really say what's causing what. So we don't know, is it the chicken or the egg? And it's certainly a lot of additional research to be done to kind of figure out that important question. But I think what we can say in general is that, people who have more symptoms don't get as far in school as those with less symptoms in FSHD. And I think Johanna's point is very good. We don't know, is it they can't get far because the symptoms are so severe, or is there something protective about going to school? So these are really important future research questions to explore.
Thank you. There's a question, if patients who present with symptoms later in life, should they expect the same rate of progression in the disease, or does it proceed more slowly?
Again, it's a very much needed and very good question that we can't answer based on this study. It's a cross-sectional study where we just had just one assessment. So the way to test this would be to do longitudinal studies, and those are currently being done. So where people are coming back to the research center and monitored over years to establish whether progression rates are similar across people or different across people, and whether age of onset plays, so what you were referring to, plays a role in that. And then in those studies, patient-reported outcomes are also implemented and are very important to measure what happens to the disease longitudinal and how is the patient perspective changed with that. So it's a good question, but this data set cannot answer that. I think it's a very interesting question though, and the other question that comes with it, if there are different rates of progression among people, why is that? Are there genetic factors? We know that a lower repeat size is associated with the earlier onset of disease, but we don't know what does the repeat length do to progression rate. So those are very interesting research questions that are not addressed by this study though, but they are being addressed currently in research studies.
Thank you. There's a question about multi-morbidities. Are there other conditions that people with FSHD have? And how does this affect symptoms and the impact of the disease?
That's also a very good point, and we did not, so there are two, I did not make a slide, limitations of the study, which I know you're just pointing out. So there's two things that we also didn't do. So we didn't look at comorbidities. We didn't record what other diseases do people have, someone who may have a disease affecting mobility or rheumatoid arthritis or autoimmune diseases. In addition, that will impact how these questions will be answered. The other aspect is medications. We didn't collect medications. If people were, treated with pain medications, could that increase fatigue and lessen the pain? All those things play a role, but we didn't assess them in this particular survey, but those will be assessed in ongoing studies. So yeah, comorbidities is important and may influence how people answer the questions. Now with specific FSHD, so as you know, there are extramuscular manifestations of FSHD, but they're a lot more rare, including the eye. And then there's, question about the heart, but we didn't address those, but I think they're relatively rare, and particularly also in more severely affected individuals with lower repeat numbers, that I think it's okay not to address them in this type of study. But again, in the ongoing research studies, where both patient-reported outcomes and on-site muscle testing, et cetera, is being evaluated over a longer period of time, those questions will be able to be answered. Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you. There's a question here about, is there an accepted measure of global function in FSHD or in neuromuscular diseases in general?
I'll defer that to Dr. Heatwole, but I can just say briefly that I'm not sure it's a global function. I'm not sure what exactly that would include, but there are other quality of life questionnaires that have been used in FSH and other disease populations, and they do, they also pick up differences between people. But again, I think the benefit of this approach is that it incorporates the patient and the unique features of FSHD. But I'll see if Dr. Heatwole has something to add about global health. Yep.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways to kind of measure global health. There really isn't one standard mechanism that is universally accepted across all neuromuscular diseases, and maybe you could even argue in FSHD. So a lot of times these are chosen for fit for purpose for what a therapy or what a company is trying to demonstrate as far as a benefit in response to a treatment. And as Johanna, Dr. Hamel mentioned, this data that she just presented was utilized as one validation step to develop a patient-reported outcome measure that is specifically designed for FSHD patients. So this is called the FSHD High or FSHD Health Index. And it measures, a patient completes this instrument, and then it develops scores, or you can get scores in multiple different domains regarding a patient's perception of their own disease burden or their own health. And so this particular instrument that was developed based on this data is very comprehensive, and it was developed based on guidance from the FDA to generate or support drug labeling claims during therapeutic trials. And so it's a commonly used instrument for that purpose. But there certainly are other instruments that are out there, more generic, that may not always gather the data that is most important to patients with FSHD. And there's other instruments too that are outside of patient-reported outcome measures. There's FSHD clinical outcome measure that's typically used, but there's other markers of disease burden that can be used in a clinical trial, how far someone can walk in a period of time, what their strength is, and it really depends on the particular study that's being done. So these are usually selected on an individual basis, and currently there isn't one that would be globally recognized by all researchers and patients as essential for use.
So here's a question that might kind of point to that sort of the distinction between the commonness of a symptom and impact on people's lives. There's a comment saying, "My eyes do not remain closed during sleep, and it causes drying of eyes, and can be everything from annoying to really painful and just debilitating for some individuals." But he's wondering, is that a common symptom? And I'm curious to what extent people report it as something that has a significant impact on quality of life.
So yes, facial weakness and inability to have complete eye closure. We see that obviously in clinic, and then sometimes it requires to wear something on top so that it doesn't dry out and the cornea doesn't get injured. Now, in this data set or in that survey, I would have to go back to the 274 questions and look if there was, or even in the 2012 paper, and look if that was
here, Johanna. I just pulled it up.
Pull it up for the eye. Yes, thank you.
So eye irritation was reported in 67% of all patients that were surveyed about that. And the mean response or impact was a 1.3 if you want to compare it to the data that Dr. Hamel presented earlier. But 67% of patients would agree with you that that's an important issue.
But it is also an issue where there are some remedies that are relatively effective for a lot of people.
Yeah, so I would discuss with your healthcare provider because there are some ways to limit or reduce that if you haven't tried. So, yeah.
Yeah, great. So we have a question here about if I don't know if your studies found whether how often people change jobs. So didn't necessarily go from having a job to being unemployed, but required a change in career because of symptom progression.
That's also an excellent question. And I think one thing that came out of the study is that we don't know enough about employment status and what the disease does to people's careers, professions. And so this survey, we did not collect this information.
Okay.
But more research is necessary, yep.
Okay. So there's a question here, really important, is how are these data and results going to be used?
So this data set was used to develop the FSHD High that Dr. Heatwole just commented on, which is a patient-reported outcome. And so and Dr. Heatwole can comment more in detail, but it's a modified version of this survey, and it's the scores, there's a particular score that comes out of it. And so this instrument, it's called an instrument, this questionnaire, then is being sent out to people again and validated. And what typically researchers have to do is to make sure that, if someone answers the survey this week, if you repeat it next week, that the answers would be the same, that the instrument is stable in its answers. And then what you want to do is demonstrate whether it changes over time along with how the disease changes. And those things are being done. So that's how the data set is being used for the FSHD High, and that Dr. Heatwole can comment in a second. But for other researchers, how this can be used is really to understand new areas of research. For example, your questions on employment status. I think there's a lot to learn. Also other symptoms to focus on or maybe incorporate. And more detailed studies have been done in pain in FSH. As you know best, pain is not equal pain in FSHD. There's different types of pain, different locations of pain. So that's how the study also can be helpful to researchers to identify new areas of interest. But I'll let Dr. Heatwole comment more on the FSHD High.
Yeah, so we initially did this study as a validation step for patient-reported outcome measure to be used in therapeutic trials. But what we found is that it's actually useful for other populations as well. So clinicians who may not be very familiar with FSHD can now reference this paper and look how common are these many different symptoms in FSHD and what's the relative impact. And so they can use that to kind of be a guide when they see a patient with this to know what to ask about. And patients are also curious, like, I have a symptom. Is this something that other patients with FSHD have? And how common is it, or is it something else? And so they've referenced that. Regulatory organizations also have utilized this data because they want to know, like, how important is a particular issue or symptom in FSHD, and as people apply for grants and therapeutic studies, they use this as a reference to see, what's the relative unmet need in this population. And then researchers use this who are saying, hey, what symptoms should I go after? What therapy should I develop for this disease population? What's most important to patients? And so a lot of researchers have said when they apply for grant funding that they're referencing this to really show that what's important to FSHD patients really is.
Thank you. Here's a kind of a funny comment. I was told, it says, that people with FSHD were on average smarter and more highly educated than other patient samples. And when you look at the statistics on the people who responded to the survey, that would seem to bear it out, but there's this issue of sample bias or who's self-selecting. What are your thoughts about that? This extraordinarily high level of, high percentage of patients with a lot of education.
Yeah, I think you already commented on what the bias is. So first of all, we sent this out to more than 500 people, and 64% sent them back completed. So we don't know about if there's any difference in if more how should I phrase it? People who went further in academic education, maybe they were more likely to send surveys back. I don't know, but that's certainly a risk of a bias. And so that I don't know. I do know that there is a selection bias in people who participate in research. So for example, usually it takes time, surveys a little less, but people who participate in research at research centers, you have to take off from work, you have to travel, you might need family support. So it takes a lot actually to participate in research. And not everyone can afford to do that. So I think we don't really have a good sense of the whole population. So we always have a risk that the sample that we're studying, the people we're studying, are not really representative of the entire population.
Right.
So I agree with you, June.
So here's a question that's maybe not addressed in your study, but it might be something that would drive an area for future research. But this is on the subject of family members with FSHD who have real variation within the family in symptoms. Is this instrument or this approach helpful in trying to understand that phenomenon?
It certainly is helpful in measuring the difference and how it affects people. To understand the mechanism why that is, I think it would require further study. So, and what I would think about, are there any environmental factors that someone might be more affected than the other, or other genetic factors, genetic modifiers, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And that's subject to future research. Yeah.
Okay, great. Here's a comment from a patient. It says, when walking, I'm easily unbalanced if I'm distracted with noises or conversation. Why or how do the senses interfere with muscle movement? And then I'm curious, just to extend that to the study, do you see any indication of that, of outcomes that are influenced by whether people are able to focus on what they're doing or have distractions?
Yeah, that's a tough question. So first, but if I was finished, and if I put my clinical hat on, I would want to make sure there's no other reason for balance issues, because we need a number of things to be balanced, and that's the eyes and the inner organ in the ear, that provide stability and vision, and then also the senses where our body parts are in space. So the nerves are important. And so as a neurologist, I would want to make sure that in addition to FSHD, there's nothing else going on in those other areas that could influence balance. But if that's not the case, then yes, just with muscle weakness, people can be off balance. And what we do to test that is, for example, a timed up and go test in clinic or in research, where we measure that. How well can people stand up, turn around, and walk back to capture that.
Great, thank you so much. This final question is maybe a little bit off topic, but maybe with your clinician hat, you can answer it. So, and I'm sharing it because he's not the first patient to mention this issue. So he says he was taking prescription medications for pain relief. For many years, he had a doctor who prescribed very moderate amounts of hydrocodone, and there were no issues with developing a dependency or addiction. That doctor retired, and my new doctor doesn't seem to want to help with my pain management unless I see a specialist for pain management. Anyway, I think the plea here is, how do I get help with getting medication or better pain management?
I think this is tough. I mean, we all struggle with treating the pain in FSHD, and that's why I think research investigating the root cause of it is important. But I would tackle it from different perspectives, and I think a physical therapist is a key player, because so I like to think about what's causing the pain, what's the root cause of the pain, and a lot in FSHD, as far as we know, a lot of the pain originates from, muscle weakness, and then compensatory muscle. So other muscles have to take over roles and compensate, and that can be a strain. Then there's asymmetry in the disease. So maybe body parts are being strained in not a very symmetric way. So that can be a source of pain. And then the truncal weakness. A lot of people I hear have back pain, or the scapula winging, the shoulder pain. And so a lot of it is mechanical, and there are ways to strengthen certain muscles with exercises and also truncal strength. But for example, for truncal weakness, I have had good response with people when they walk, and then the upper body kind of leans forward with time, and so they have a struggle holding themselves up. High walking sticks, for example, can be very useful to help lift up the body, and then less strain on the bones and on the tendons, and that can reduce pain. So there are little tricks and tweaks that you can sort out with your physical therapist, what to do to address the pain, and those are non-medical. With regards to medication, we have a number of medications that we try, and it's always trial and error, because it's not, something might work in one person but not in the other. And so having a doctor who knows a little bit about FSH and about the mechanisms, how it can cause pain, and then try to work with those medications. I think that seeing a pain specialist is typically what's recommended, but because also injections or so are preferred over taking medications that have side effects and can make you tired and more fatigued, which is a problem already. It's not a bad idea. And I think sometimes you just have to get some different opinions from different people, physical therapist, your muscle specialist, your neuromuscular specialist. Your primary is a key player in coordinating all this. And then an opinion of a pain specialist, I think, can be helpful, just to see if there's anything that can be done with local injections, which would have less side effects. And that was my clinical head, because that's what I would say to a clinic patient.
Yeah. All right, great, thank you. A couple more questions have come in. What percentage of patients with FSHD use a power chair or scooter?
So a power chair or scooter, I don't know exactly about those specific, but about 20% of patients with FSHD require a wheelchair eventually, but I don't know, it's not, I'm not sure I know exactly which type is being used. And then it's also important to think about, it does make a difference if someone is using a wheelchair at all times or part-time, just, in the supermarket, or, when going to Disneyland for an all-day trip. So it varies really. It's important to look at how frequent the wheelchair is actually required when you look at data as such, how many people actually do use wheelchairs, and then how frequent and how often.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And maybe one last question here is, did you find any differences between FSHD1 and FSHD2 patients?
Also, great question. We did not assess the difference in this particular study. So patients were listed as FSHD as part of the registry, but we do not have data on whether they had type 1 or type 2.
Great. Okay, well, thank you so much. Maybe one very final question is what happens next? Where does this line of research go? Do you have plans? Do you have ongoing studies? Or will patients have an opportunity to participate in some future direction of this research?
So the FSHD High, which came out of this, is a patient-reported outcome that's being used in several studies at the moment, or shorter versions of it. And I think there are more studies assessing pain and particular more specific topics in FSHD. And I think what has really become reality is that there's barely any study without including the patient perspective nowadays. So if you participate in research, you will see a lot, either this tool, similar questions as you saw today, or a questionnaire with a similar design. But I think there's not going to be a study where you will not be asked these questions, which I think is great. Now, where do we go from here? The question is always, could that be a primary outcome measure? For example, if you do a study and really your one goal is to see a change in patient-reported outcomes, I think that's where we're not quite there yet, but that will be evaluated in the future, how that can be the patient voice, really be the main outcome. And I'll let Dr. Heatwole comment further on that.
Yeah, that's right. So, so this instrument has been developed and tested, and the reliability and sent back to patients to make sure it's usable. It's in multiple clinical trials, and as Dr. Hamel mentioned, it really is a useful guide to detect disease burden from the patient's perspective, to allow a patient really to help report how severe their disease is at any one point in time. And so this is being used pretty widely in pharmaceutical company studies and academic studies to really track how patients' disease burden is changing over time, just in general, or in response to therapy. And so there's studies that are looking at this longitudinally. We've completed one study here called the Cromfish study that looked at how this instrument tracks patients' disease over time. We're also conducting a therapeutic study here called the Starfish study that is evaluating the use of testosterone and HGH for muscle function in patients with FSHD. And this is one of the outcome measures of that particular trial. And so I think going forward, it's going to be important to really understand how disease burden changes over time in patients, and report, what is the standard progression that we see in this disease.
Thank you so very much for that. I'm going to now bring back Beth Johnston for some closing remarks and announcements.
Yes.
Anyway, we're all virtually applauding. Thank you for that wonderful presentation.
Thank
Very
you.
excellent, excellent. I do want to note that June did post the link to this paper in our chat, but we will also have it available on the Sequester page, web page that we have online. I think we will be able to do that, won't we, June? Be able to put a link to the, okay, good, great.
And I would just like to point out one thing, because I think the eye irritation question was great. And there's so many questions in that survey that if you have interest, there is a table, a supplemental table to that paper where all questions are listed with patient responses. So if you don't find a symptom that you're interested in those 15 symptomatic themes, or in the main paper, there's a supplemental table where you can find actually all questions and all answers. Yep.
Actually, would you send me a PDF of this article with the supplemental table?
Yeah.
And thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to everyone who attended our 6th Sequester Camp webinar. I can't believe it's been 6 weeks. We're doing okay. We're going to make it, guys. And a very, very, very special thank you to our guest speakers today. Thank you so much. That was amazing. We will be updating our Sequester Camp webpage with these recordings. So this is being recorded and we'll post the recordings there, as well as with other information as it arises, the PDF from this report, etc. So please check back there often. As a matter of fact, I'm going to post the link to our Sequester Camp webpage in the chat so everyone has it. Also, I just wanted to remind everybody on Wednesdays, our beloved Belinda Miller is still broadcasting her weekly book reading. She's going to start doing this on Facebook Live starting next week at 2 o'clock Eastern. And then our radio show celebrity, Tim Hollenbach, who's online today with us, is also hosting his weekly radio show at 9 o'clock Eastern on Wednesdays via Facebook Live. So be sure to dial in and chat with Tim during his show on Wednesday nights. Then I also wanted to announce, starting in May, on Mondays at 3 o'clock Eastern, we'll have a weekly Zoom fitness training session with one of our longtime FSHD Society members, Bill Hersberg, and his trainer, Mitch Wade. So that should be really fun and interesting. Keep an eye out for our email update announcing the topics of upcoming webinars for sure. And we hope to see you guys again next week. And as always, everyone take care. And please, please, please stay healthy and stay at home. All right. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Okay.